You're listening to the Labor Notes podcast, the weekly show from Labor Notes on rank and file news and organizing tactics. I'm pod co-host Danielle Smith, organizer at Labor Notes.
And I'm pod co-host Natasha Eleni Ullman, a staff writer at Labor Notes.
We're back in the Stewards Corner, our cozy spot in the pod where we talk about organizing advice for union stewards. It's based on the long-running column in Labor Notes magazine where stewards and organizers describe strategies to build better connections on the shop floor, to defend against discipline, and to keep building power.
These columns and episodes are also pretty much always relevant to members who aren't stewards because they speak to how you and your coworkers can work together to build a strong, fighting union. Today's topic is an especially good example. We're talking about Weingarten rights.
Wait, Natasha, I don't think we can go to a Weingarten right now. It's the middle of the workday.
No, Weingarten, Weingarten rights, which is the right of union members to ask for a steward to be present at any meeting with a manager which the member believes could lead to their discipline.
Oh, right. I knew that. It helps a lot for the member and steward to be on the same page going into these meetings, and them both being clear about the role the steward would play. Part of the goal is to get management to back off any unfair discipline, to make sure that what they put in writing about the member's conduct is accurate, and that any performance expectations being laid out at the meeting are reasonable.
Management will likely try to throw a lot at the member and steward or attempt to steamroll, so you definitely want to prepare ahead of time. We got a lot of great advice in a Stewards Corner piece back in 2010, still very relevant, by labor attorney Robert Schwartz and Clark Peters, who at the time was a grievance handler for 1199 NE SEIU when the article was published, titled Representing Members at Investigatory Interviews. You can read it at labornotes.org, and we've also linked it in the episode description. And here with us today, we have our coworker, Kari Thompson, a Labor Notes organizer who, like Danielle, leads some of our Stewards Workshops. Welcome, Kari. Thanks for being here.
Howdy, y'all.
Before we get into some specific advice, I would love to get both of your takes on a big picture question. In your experience, what makes a steward intervention successful in this kind of meeting?
Thanks. Well, I think first it's helpful to be really specific about the kind of meeting we're talking about. So this is, any time management is investigating something that happened at work or is related to your work performance. And this could be in person or it could be on the phone. Maybe we'll talk about that later. So it's not necessarily the meeting where they're giving you discipline. It's the meeting where they're thinking about doing that. Although at some workplaces, they might end up being the same thing. But under just cause language, and if you have a union contract, it better have just cause, which is a separate set of rules that apply to discipline and what makes discipline fair or not. But under those rules, the boss has to do a fair investigation to determine credible facts before they can issue discipline. And so this is really the member's opportunity to give their side of any story. And they have the right to ask to have a representative go in with them. And that's the role of the steward in the Weingarten rights meeting, is to be the person who has the back of the member. So they know they're not alone. They have somebody there who's on their side. And they also can keep management in check. So if management starts raising their voice at the member, or maybe they're asking the same question over and over again, the steward can intervene. And that can really help the member be able to answer honestly and know that they're not alone. And it's also a really straightforward example of exhibiting solidarity in the workplace. You are showing up for someone else.
I completely agree. And I honestly feel like just having the steward in the room, it's already a successful intervention. I know a lot of new stewards or stewards who maybe haven't done one of these meetings before are often very nervous that they're going to go in there and make things worse. But I really haven't found that to be the case. For many of the reasons Kari described, just having a steward in the room with them makes such a huge difference for the member. I also do think, though, that to make it as successful as it can be, it's really important, actually, that the member and the steward have a chance to touch base before the meeting, and so that the member can understand what rights they have going into it, understand what management can and can't do, and that the steward can keep management in check, as Kari said. There are some solid pieces of advice in the article we just mentioned about what you're entitled to in these meetings as a steward, where in the context of representing the member, you're on equal footing with management, even if you're a fellow subordinate on the job. And Kari did a really great job of describing exactly the type of meeting where stewards legally have to be allowed to be there for the member. But I think there are other types of meetings where maybe members just really feel like they could use an advocate or could use someone. And I think it's good for us for building our power in the workplace to push the boundaries a little bit. And I would send stewards into all sorts of meetings, but it is good to understand where we actually have the legal right to be there and where we are flexing our power a little bit to say, hey, actually, we're just going to show up for this. Some things the article talks about in terms of what we're entitled to in these meetings is that the first thing you can do is ask the manager why they're calling the member into the meeting. You as the steward have a right to know what the meeting is about, and so does the member, so that you can know what is being investigated. And when they tell you what's being investigated, they shouldn't just, pivot the meeting in the middle to something else. You can push back on that and say, hey, this meeting is about this. You can schedule a separate meeting for that. And the manager is really supposed to tell you. And another thing I would flag about all of this is that, sometimes management doesn't actually know what we are legally entitled to. So we should be ready to assert that, but then also ready for if they don't know the rules or aren't, following what's meant to be done. Another thing that we're entitled to is, like I mentioned earlier, you are entitled to ask for time to talk to the member in what's called a caucus before the manager tries to rush you both into the meeting. That gives you time to talk privately with the member to understand what's going on and to get some facts down before you head in. I would also flag that you can call a caucus during the meeting as well. So if the manager does, bring up an unexpected piece of information, or I often find it helpful, these meetings can get very emotional because it's tough for the member and sometimes they need a moment to take a breather or need a moment to compose themselves. And that's also a great time to call a caucus. These rights might seem straightforward enough, but it can be trickier in practice, especially as I mentioned, if the manager involved in the meeting doesn't know about these rights or the manager is really trying to steamroll you. And you might find that you have to be pretty assertive. Kari, I'm curious, what are some common things that can go wrong before a meeting like this?
I would say the first thing that can go wrong is the member not asking to have representation. So there are some union contracts out there that require management to get a steward in advance for workers, but that's something that you can bargain for. That's not what the law says. So the law says that the worker has to ask for representation. And there are lots of unions out there that have little Weingarten cards that you can stick in your wallet, or maybe you can slip it inside your badge that you might have to clock in with, and you could put it in the back or something like that. It can be great to have a little prop that can help people remember they have those rights and to ask for them when they need them. Because if you don't ask for the representation, you lose that right to have it there. And another thing that management sometimes can do is to try to discourage a member from having the representation. So a member can ask, and then management, unfortunately, actually has the right to say, oh, are you sure that you want a steward? You don't have to have one. This meeting's going to be really short. And then the member can waive that right by saying something like, yeah, okay, sure, I don't have to have a steward. And then all of a sudden you lost it, right? So that's all happening even before the meeting has technically started. So it's really important for members to feel confident in asking for representation. I think another thing that we've seen increasingly with the connectivity that bosses have to their workers is bosses trying to do these interviews outside of the workplace, either over the phone or even in a text message. If they are asking questions that are investigating something that happened on the job, you have the right to ask for a steward, even if it delays the interview, right? So you have the right, if the boss calls you at home and says, hey, we need to talk about something that happened last week, you have the right then to say, okay, I request a steward. And when the boss says, oh, but it's on the phone, how are we going to get someone? You say, well, we have to get someone. I'm not going to answer those questions until we do, right? So sometimes it takes some confidence, not just on the steward's part, but on the member's part to really assert their right to have that representation and to make a member feel confident in that. A great thing to do is to make sure you're reminding them of these rights really often and making sure you have enough stewards in different parts of the workplace so that people have somebody that they can call that they know, that they trust, and that understands things that are going on in their department in the workplace.
Yeah, you mentioned connectivity, which is sort of a double-edged sword. The plus side being that workers actually have certain rights to the digital paper trail in terms of a disciplinary process. For more on that, you can tune into our podcast episode, Did You Know You're Allowed to Read Your Boss's Emails?, which went up May 9th. Schwartz and Peters, who wrote this piece on Weingarten rights, also talk about how the steward can step in if the boss tries to intimidate or disorient the member during the meeting. What does this look like in practice, and what can a steward do?
Yeah, this is something that stewards have to be prepared to do. So the steward can be an advocate for the member in these meetings, though it should be stated the steward doesn't have the right to answer questions for the member. The member does have to ask. And that's one of those pieces of advice that the steward should clarify with a member prior to the meeting happening, right? That their role is to back them up, back the member up. Their role is not to be their attorney and answer questions on their behalf. So when a boss does something like repeating a question multiple times, the steward can pipe up and say, "You've already asked that question and Jane has answered it. It's time to move on. Do you have any other questions, or is the meeting over?" Right? Because the meeting is supposed to be about something really specific. So if the boss is out of questions, maybe it's just time to end it. Or maybe if the boss is trying to switch topics, definitely, as Danielle was mentioning, the steward can intervene and say, "Oh, I'm sorry. You told us that this meeting was going to be about an incident that happened last week. So we're not going to talk about something that happened yesterday. Do you have any more questions about what happened last week?" If the boss tries to yell at the worker, you can definitely intervene and say, "Hey, I think it would all be in our best interest if we kept this meeting professional. Could you please stop yelling at the member?" If the member starts crying, please ask for a caucus and give them a chance to compose themselves. If the member speaks a language other than English, you as a steward can advocate for them to have interpretation during the meeting so that they have the best opportunity to tell their side of the story accurately. So, depending on your specific workplace context, some of these things might be more or less relevant.
Yeah, I think that's all great advice. And the piece talks about some of the other active ways to defend the member at the meeting. And one of them is preparing with the member beforehand on how to answer different types of questions. And, the bosses might try to frame this as like, you're cooking up a story, but that's not the case. It's just that the bosses have had time to prepare for this meeting. They're coming in kind of with their case, and the members should be prepared as well. And like Kari was saying, know that they don't have to answer irrelevant questions or keep answering questions if the bosses keep asking them. And so one of the things you might want to prepare with them is like what they should acknowledge, what they shouldn't needlessly quote unquote admit. That's often one of the reasons why a manager might ask the same question over and over again to get them, just talking. And also how they should approach management and really just how best to make it through the meeting. Kari, can you talk more about why it's so important to be careful and strategic about how a member answers questions in this type of meeting?
The reason it's so important is that anything the member says in this meeting can be used against them for discipline. But that really cuts both ways. So this is also the time to prevent discipline. So if the member knows really specific information or has really clear evidence of why something actually is not the case or doesn't apply to them, we want to make sure they bring it up. It's also really important that they be honest, because dishonesty can be used to make a discipline worse in some cases, especially if the boss might have direct evidence that contradicts what a member said. We can, as stewards, advise a member that they can say they don't remember or that they're not sure if they need more time to think about something. But if they do know the answer, it's usually best not to be fully evasive, because this meeting is the best opportunity for the steward to help the member reduce discipline or prevent discipline from being issued at all. So the steward should ask the member about any extenuating circumstances that might come into play for this particular situation. Did the member have a death in the family? Did the member work late the previous shift? Are there things that are relevant to whatever happened that the steward can potentially bring up on behalf of the member in case the member forgets? It's also a good time before the meeting to try to set up a little communication system with the member. So the steward has the right to take notes during the meeting. And, if you want to make a little code with the member that if you tap your notebook 4 times, they should stop talking. You could do that, right? If you feel like they're offering more information than they need to. Because one of the best pieces of advice to give to a member is just answer the question that's being asked. Don't volunteer too much information. And if you think the member is starting to do that, then you can tap your notebook 4 times and hope that they hear you and that they clam up.
This is really good advice, and there are a number of jobs I've had in the past where I wish you had been my steward. The last bit of advice in this piece is about written statements that the boss might ask the member to sign after the meeting. How will management use these written statements, and what should the member and steward watch for when they're reviewing them?
Well, first, they should read them. You should always read something if you're going to sign it. I know we get really used to clicking the I've read it terms and conditions button, right? But when this is about your job, you definitely need to read what's in front of you before you sign it. So if there's any inaccuracies, you can point them out and ask the boss to change them. You can also, depending on your workplace and the practices that you've established there, some places like to sign something and then write underneath signed under protest or something like that if the member disagrees with what is being put forward. If you fail to sign the document, though, that can be considered insubordination. So it's usually best to sign it to say that you received it. And then you get to also have a copy of it because you signed it.
Yeah, that's great advice, Kari. One other thing I'd like to note, like everything we talk about, Weingarten meetings can be an organizing opportunity too. Management really counts on shame and embarrassment about discipline as a way to keep people from talking to each other or fighting back. We should always be thinking about how we can bring in more members when it's time to fight the fight. You should talk with the member about what they're comfortable with, but we shouldn't just reinforce the idea that getting called into one of these meetings is a shameful thing. I've seen some really powerful organizing when members have been willing to talk about their discipline with the rest of their unit, and have also seen packing Weingarten meetings with stewards or even a member's other team members as a strategy for pushing back on egregious discipline.
That's a great point, Danielle. And the other thing that we should always do after one of these meetings is make sure to follow up with the member after the fact. Whether that's the next day or, the next week, you should ask if there's anything else they thought of that might be relevant, especially if discipline still hasn't been issued. It's good to document things as soon as possible. And you should also just check in with them about the discipline itself if one was issued. Do they want to grieve it? Do they not want to grieve it? Do you as the steward know that actually 3 other people have recently been disciplined for the same thing and maybe there's grounds for a group grievance? And you can do some of this organizing that Danielle is talking about to help people understand that actually it's not just them. The boss is coming after people and it's time for everybody to stand up and fight back.
Thanks so much for joining us again, Kari. That's our show. Rate us or leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. If you're listening to us on Podbean at labornotespodcast.podbean.com, download our episode.
The Labor Notes Podcast is produced by Danielle Smith, Sindhu Sundar, and myself. Our title music was written and performed by our coworker, Keith Brower Brown. See you next week. Solidarity, y'all.